Hey guys, welcome to Unplugged Performance. Today we're going to be installing our Sport Pro coilovers paired with our adaptive suspension cancellor kit on this 2024 Model 3 Performance. However, if you don't have a 24 Plus Model 3 Performance, the cancellor kit does not apply to you. Our Sport Pro coilovers are available for both the Model 3 and Y platform. Now, we have had a few different iterations of the Sport coilover kit in the past. However, we've determined that 14K is the best spring rate for vehicles that will be both daily driven and taken to the track. Now let's talk about what comes in the box. We have 2 front spring and shock assemblies, 2 rear shocks, as well as 2 springs with the height adjusters in the rear. On the Model 3 and Y platform, the front suspension assembly does utilize a traditional coilover where the spring is over the shock, whereas in the rear, the shock and spring are separated from each other. This kit also comes with spanner wrenches for adjustments as well as 2 front damper adjuster knobs. Now, if you're purchasing this for a 24 Plus Model 3 Performance, you will also be getting a cancellor kit. This includes 2 front and rear cancellors as well as the mounting hardware. These are designed to negate any errors when installing aftermarket coilovers. These coilovers offer both height adjustability as well as adjustable damping, which allow you to tune your suspension for your driving characteristics or needs, whether that be for daily driving and or track use. And with that said, we have the car up on the lift, let's get to it. Using a floor jack and jack stands, or a 4-point lift if available, safely raise and secure the vehicle. Using a 21mm socket, remove the 5 lugs from the front wheels. If you have a 24 Plus Model 3 Performance, you will need to disconnect the adaptive suspension module. To do this, you're going to use a pry tool, pull back on the red portion of the clip, and then grab the assembly. Once the cable assembly has been disconnected, you can then pull away at the secondary rubber grommet mounting point by pulling the cable assembly away from the vehicle, like so. We're going to tuck this cable out of the way behind the fender liner so we can proceed to remove the rest of the front factory shock assembly. Next, using a pry tool, you would disconnect the wheel speed sensor cable assembly from the upright and the front upper control arm. Next, using a 10mm socket, remove the bolt retaining the brake line to the upright. Next, using an 18mm socket, remove the nut that retains the end link to the lower shock mount. Using a 21mm end wrench and socket, remove the bolt that retains the lower shock mount to the lower control arm. Using a T50 Torx bit and a 15mm socket, remove the nut and bolt that retain the front upper control arm drop pin to the upright. Now, in order to remove the bolt from the upright, you want to press downward on the front upper control arm to be able to slide this out, and then carefully let go as there is preloaded pressure from the front upper control arm to come up. And now we can proceed to open the hood and gain access to the front upper shock assembly. Next, you'll want to remove the upper cowling by pulling upward to disengage the push clips. There we go. Now with the upper cowling removed, using a 10mm socket, you can remove the 6 bolts retaining the front trunk assembly to the vehicle. Next, using a plastic pry tool, you will want to disengage the 3 push clips that retain the front light assembly to the front itself. To do this, you will slide this on the top like so, and then push away, and then pull up on the assembly and away, so you have access to actually disengage the power assembly for the front light. To do so, you're going to use a pick tool to disengage the locking tab here, to then disconnect the cable assembly. Lastly, before we remove the tub assembly from the vehicle, we do need to disconnect this air duct up top. To do this, you will pull up on the push clips, like so, and now we're ready to remove the tub. Now to do this, you're going to want to pull up from the center and ensure that you disengage the mounting clips on either side of the front tub. Next, using a pick tool, you want to remove the 3 push clips that are retaining the upper flap to the chassis. Next, using a pick tool, remove the push clip retaining the wiper cowling to the vehicle. With that last push clip removed, we now have access to all 4 bolts that are responsible for retaining the front upper control arm cradle assembly to the vehicle. Using a 13mm and a 15mm socket, remove the top 4 retainer bolts. Be sure when removing the final retainer bolt that you have one hand on the shock assembly, as it will lower from the vehicle once removed. Now, when removing the front shock and cradle assembly, we do find it easier to essentially scoot this upright forward so that the axle and the front lower control arm align with each other, which will make removal of this assembly a lot easier. Now, when you are doing this, be sure to pull the loose and disconnected brake line below the shock actuator if you have a 24 Plus Model 3 Performance. Next, using a 13mm socket, you're going to disconnect the 3 nuts that retain the front upper control arm cradle assembly to the shock top. Once that's disconnected, then we can remount this to the Unplugged Performance coilover. Now we're ready to install the front upper control arm cradle assembly onto the Unplugged Performance coilover. Using a 13mm socket, secure the front upper control arm cradle assembly to the top hat. Okay, now we're ready to get this in the car. Next, reinstall the 21mm bolt and nut that retain the lower shock mount to the front lower control arm. Using the T50 Torx bolt and the 15mm nut, resecure the front upper control arm drop pin into the upright. Next, using the factory 18mm nut, resecure the end link to the new lower shock mount. Reconnect the wheel speed sensor cable assembly to the upright and the front upper control arm assembly. Next, using the factory 10mm bolt, resecure the brake line bracket to the upright. Now, torque all hardware to spec. Next, you'll be installing your UP front cancellor kit. These are identified both by the script on the backside, as well as the fronts will have 2 posts, whereas the rears will actually have a zip tie slot instead. So for this, we're going to essentially have the socket portion facing forward on the vehicle. And when installing this, we're going to be using our zip tie that's preloaded with an alligator clip, and that alligator clip will be facing the actual vehicle itself. The slot we're going to be targeting here is going to be this hole, or square hole, in the chassis itself. So with our socket facing forward, you essentially will use this preloaded like such, and then on the top of the alligator clip, you want the opening facing downward. You'll actually press down once you slide the alligator clip over the chassis. Okay, so I want it about there. So this does take quite a bit of pressure. Okay, now that we have the gator clip installed on the vehicle, we can essentially slide the 2 legs from the front cancellor over the outside and then slide the zip tie into both the upper and lower slots and lock it down accordingly. Okay, now with the adaptive suspension wire or cable assembly, you can essentially come back, plug this in on the backside, and once everything's adequately installed, you can go ahead and cut away the excess zip tie material. Next, you'll reinstall the push clip that retains the windshield wiper cowling to the chassis, followed by the 3 push clips that retain this flat cover to the vehicle. Now before we install the front tub assembly, one thing to keep in mind is we do need to finish assembling our dampers by applying the damper adjuster knob to the shock top itself. Now to do this, you will use a 2mm Allen key and look for the set screw to apply torque. You always want to make sure that you're going full stiff to reset the inner shims before you make any sort of adjustment. So in this case, we're going to go clockwise all the way and then click back to our preferred adjustment. For baseline testing, we recommend setting these at 16 clicks from full stiff. Next, you'll reinstall the front tub assembly. Now be sure that when you do this, that you don't pinch the power cable to the front light. Once everything is clipped into place, you can essentially plug in the powered cable to the tub light and then insert the light housing. Now that that's taken care of, we can proceed to reinstall the 10mm bolts. Next, you'll proceed to the air intake by reinstalling the push clips. Once that's taken care of, you can reinstall the top cowling. And now we'll move to the rear. Using a 21mm socket, remove the 5 lugs on the rear wheel. Now with the wheels off, we're going to proceed to remove the shock and spring from the vehicle. First, you're going to want to remove the lower spring arm cover if your vehicle does have one, using a 10mm socket. Once that's done, you will use either a transmission jack or a floor jack, depending on what type of lift situation you have, to support the rear lower control arm. Using a 21mm socket and end wrench, remove the 2 21mm bolts that retain the lower control arm to the hub assembly and the shock assembly. Once both 21mm bolts have been removed, you can release the pressure that's holding the rear lower control arm. And once this is done, you can proceed to remove the spring and shock from the vehicle. Then before you remove the shock, be sure to disconnect the adaptive damper cable assembly from the shock. And then remove the rubber grommet retaining the cable assembly to the shock. Using a 15mm socket, remove the 2 bolts retaining the rear shock top hat to the chassis. Next, pulling down on the rear lower control arm, you can gain access to the rear spring and remove it like so. Now that we have the rear spring removed, we can carry over the top spring rubber isolator to the new coilover spring. Now the portion that has the larger diameter is going to be essentially mounting to the chassis, and the portion that has the smaller diameter will essentially meet on the rear spring height adjuster. So these will sit in there like so. Now with one hand, we're going to pull down on the rear spring arm and slide the new spring assembly into place like so. Once that's done, we can proceed to disassemble the rear shock and transfer the top hat over to the new shock assembly. Hey. Next, using a 17mm socket, remove the lock nut that is retaining the top hat to the shock piston. All right, now we're going to carry over just the top hat itself, not the OEM dust boot and bump stop. We'll be using the 14mm nut that is provided on these shocks to retain this top hat here. Before you install the shock onto the car, you want to be sure that you apply final torque to that top nut, using an open wrench for a counter hold. Next, using 15mm socket, reinstall the bolts retaining the top hat to the chassis. Now that the top hat has been installed, you can apply pressure to the rear lower control arm again to reinstall the 21mm bolts that retain the hub to the rear lower control arm, as well as the lower shock mount to the lower control arm. Now, because the shock mount does use a rubber bushing, it is extremely important that when you do apply torque to the lower control arm, that you are doing so while it's under load. So be sure that there is pressure holding the rear lower control arm when you apply final torque. Now we're going to install the rear cancellor kit. In order to do so, we need to disconnect the adaptive suspension cable assembly from the mounting tab here. To do so, you will use a pry tool and pull away. Now when installing the rear cancellor module, be sure to have the electrical socket facing downward. Now you want to be sure that you insert this mounting tab into the bracket. Once that's done, you will slide a zip tie and then bring this around and ensure that the zip tie itself falls into the slotted sections on the module itself. Once you're happy with your mounting position, you can go ahead and fasten the zip tie. Cut away the excess material and proceed to tuck the excess wire assembly. Next, we'll be wrapping the cable assembly itself. In order to do this, we need to gain access to behind the fender liner here by removing these lower push clips. First, we'll be connecting the module itself, plugging it in, and then we will be looping the excess material here and making 2 small loops and then zip tying the excess material to this parking brake electrical line. Now, similar to the front, the rear damper adjuster is going to essentially follow the same cadence, where in order to make any adjustments, you want to make sure that you are going full clockwise if you were to look from the top of the shock before making any adjustments, and then adjust back to your preferred setting. These do also come at 16 clicks from the factory, which is a good starting point as a baseline. However, you are more than welcome to fine-tune this accordingly for your intended use case. All right, that just about concludes our installation for today. Now, anytime that you do replace a suspension component, we do highly recommend that you do get a vehicle alignment. Once we get the wheels back on and torqued, we'll go ahead and take it for a test drive and then get this thing on the rack. Now, if you'd like to see us install any parts on a Tesla Model 3 Performance or any Tesla platform for that matter, go ahead and let us know in the comments below. See you guys next time.